I want to know your number one piece of advice then for parents whose child looks like they are struggling.
You need to meet them head on and ask the question. It's a hard question. Have you ever thought about suicide? Tell me more. And ask open-ended questions. And then you need to be quiet and you need to listen and you need to not judge them and you need to give them space to talk. If they know they have a safe, judgment-free space to talk at home, that's going to be incredibly protective for them as they grow up.
And they talk. Well, hello there, Leslie Weirich.
Hi, Suzanne.
Thank you for coming on my podcast. You're in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Northern Indiana, close to Michigan.
You are a mental health speaker, author, military suicide prevention advocate, and I know you speak about that. And you started leslieshope.org, which we're going to get into. I want to hear about you, but I just want to, start by saying my goal today is for other parents to find the hope of connection through grief and how that connection happens and what it is. And I also want to talk about suicide prevention with you. But first, let's talk about you. What would you like to see out of today?
May is Mental Health Awareness Month, so thank you for having me on this month. Yeah, this is an important month. The two most important months in what I do, the work that I do, are May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month, which I believe every month should be Mental Health Awareness Month. Yeah. But then September is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, and I'll talk about the significance of that for our family. So those 2 months are really important to me. And, I really want to just kind of, touch base with people who really are struggling in the aftermath of their grief and they feel stuck. I wrote a book last year called The Gifts of Grief, How 4 Decades of Loss Shaped My Life. And I feel like there's, grief is something we never get over. Grief changes us forever. We are forever changed. We love that person deeply, and when we lost them, their loss changed and shaped the rest of our life. So I always say grief comes in 2 parts, Suzanne. The first is your loss, and the second is the remaking of your life. So I'm in the second half. I'm in the remaking of my life after my loss. And that's really what I want to share with people is that, you can take your grief with you. It ebbs and it flows, but it'll always be part of you. But you can let your life slowly, with time, with support, with healing, grow up around your grief again.
Okay, great. Well, let's start a bit more about just you and your life. Tell me about your beautiful son, Austin.
I'll back up a little bit. Our 20-year-old son, Austin, died by suicide on World Suicide Prevention and Awareness Day.
Did he? I didn't know that.
The significance of that day wasn't lost on us, but Austin was what the world would call a high achiever. He was an overachiever. Graduated above what's a perfect 4.0 in the United States. So he graduated above a perfect 4.0. He was voted the scholar athlete in track and football all 4 years of high school. He received the Hugh O'Brien Leadership Award, which is only given to one student in the entire high school. To be nominated by your principal, you go to a leadership conference. He achieved that. He was a member of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. He was a Stay in Bounds ambassador. He put his letter jacket on and he'd go into the elementary and the middle schools and he talked to the young people about making good choices in life and making good decisions. He was a role model. So, when you look at, I always tell everybody, suicide can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. And that's the message that I want to give today, because to this day, 9 years later, in the small town where we raised him, if you ask anybody, they would say he was the last kid in this town we ever thought would die by suicide. So, when he chose a college, he had multiple college offers. Through his grades, through academics, through athletics, he could have gone to several different schools. He chose a very small, all-male, private college west of Indianapolis, Indiana, called Wabash. Now, the significance is there's only 2 colleges left in our country that are all male. There's Wabash and there's Hampden-Sydney in Virginia. And Austin chose Wabash. So he entered college in the fall of 2014, loved the game of football. I mean, would crawl out there on bloody knees to play the game of football. So he was on the football team. His freshman year, he had 3 back-to-back football injuries in an 8-week period of time. Now, none of them were really big or significant, but the combination of them. And the last one took him by ambulance off the field and took him out of the game for the remainder of the season. So we knew at that point, that things were changing with his mental health. And, we had no idea the exact toll that had really taken on him. His sophomore year, he tried to kind of get back into the game. He never really could play the same way again after those injuries. The beginning of his junior year, September 10th, our son would die by suicide. And, it was, I'm a really light sleeper. Any little noise can wake me up in the middle of the night. Now, my husband, he can sleep through anything. Nothing bothers him. So I heard all this commotion downstairs, and there was, a pounding on my door and ringing on my doorbell like my house was just on fire. And I jumped out of bed really quickly, and I woke my husband up, and I just told him somebody's at our front door. And I always say, before he could even get out of bed, I was bolting down the front stairs. And I looked in our front window, and I could see the police car parked in front of our house. And my husband was coming downstairs then, so we opened the door together, and there was 2 police officers parked on our front porch. Standing on our front porch. And that's something that you never ever want to see, but you really don't want to see that at 2:30 in the morning as a parent. And the first officer asked us if we had a son named Austin Weirich who attended Wabash College, and we said, yes, we do. And then he handed us this card, and he told us that Austin had been in an accident, and we needed to call the number on the card, which was the college. So we grabbed that card out of his hand as fast as we could, and we ran back into our house to find our cell phones. And, we called the number, and the dean of the college answered, and he told us that there had been an accident that evening in Austin's townhouse, and he was with a young woman, and there had been an argument, and our son had shot himself. And he told us that they were live flighting him to St. Vincent's Hospital, which is in Indianapolis. And we needed to get there, but, the problem was we lived 3 hours from that hospital. So, we got dressed as quickly as we could, and it was the worst thunderstorm to this day I've ever seen in my life. Rain and lightning and thunder, like, you couldn't see in front of you. And we were about 20 minutes on the way, and my cell phone rang. And it was the emergency room doctor at the hospital. And he asked if we were on our way. And I said, yes, we were. And he wanted to know if we could pull over to the side of the road so he could talk to us. And he told us that the ambulance had just arrived with our son, and there was no pulse. And in that moment, my brain couldn't really wrap around the words he was saying. Like, I couldn't grab a hold of it. I just asked him, what do you mean there's no pulse? And, Keith was hearing the conversation, and, he just, hit his fist on the steering wheel and put his head down and just cried out, why, Austin? Why? And, we drove on in complete shock and silence the rest of the trip. And we get close to the hospital, and Keith looks over at me and he just says, Leslie, I just feel like even God's crying with us tonight, because that rain never let up that night. And, I believe that he was. 9 years this September 10th. And we have shared our story. So on the 2-year anniversary of Austin's death, which would be September 10th of 2018, the co-captain of his team, a young man by the name of Evan Hansen, out of Carmel, Indianapolis, also died by suicide. So both young men knew each other, both played on the same team, the same small, private, all-male college, and both died by suicide on World Suicide Prevention Awareness Day. Our story was covered in the Indianapolis Star. We shared our part of the story of Austin with Evan's parents, who shared their part of the story. Now, he had been playing tackle football since he was a young boy, 7 years old. I'm not a fan of tackle football. I could give parents lots of information and details about that. But his parents were really brave. They donated his brain tissue within a couple hours of his death very quickly. Wow. And it came back confirmed stage 1 CTE, because you can only confirm chronic traumatic encephaly, which happens with repeated blows to the brain. You can only confirm that after death. You cannot confirm it when someone's alive. So it came back confirmed stage 1 CTE. Evan was a biology major. He'd been doing the research. He knew he had it. He had some memory loss. So they have done tremendous work since his death in the past 7 years. They have raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for concussion research. Our story made the Indianapolis Star on a Wednesday, and by that Saturday, um, we had made national news here as a human interest sports story.
Mm-hmm.
So I started getting calls. I was working full time as a recruiter, and I started getting calls about coming to speak to smaller groups and local groups. And then in 2019, a few months after Evan's death, um, the largest nonprofit in my state invited me to be the keynote speaker at their fundraiser. And that evening, it was the fifth year in a row they did this fundraiser. I took the stage for 24 minutes and we raised over $249,000 to put licensed clinical therapists in schools. So I knew that night I had an aha moment that this story had some power to it, that we could use it. We could use it to raise money for mental health. We could use it for a lot of things. So, I continued on. And as you know, the next year, the world shuts down with COVID. And I was still working full time. And I had already decided that I needed to get out more often and speak more often. But when, because I was still working.
Busy. Yeah.
So when COVID shut the world down, I ended up resigning from my job in May of 2020. And I've actually published my resignation letter on LinkedIn telling why I was going to be, because I was using LinkedIn
Wow.
sort of as finding candidates and, working. But I said, this is what I'm going to be doing with my future. And I had received thousands and thousands and thousands of DMs and messages from parents, from brothers, from sisters who had lost someone to suicide. So I knew that, a personal story is what really gets people. I always start all of my talks, Suzanne. Now I've spoke all over the nation, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But, I start my talks with a Navajo proverb, and it always says, tell me the facts and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it'll stay in my heart forever.
Totally. Totally.
Really, stories really, right? Stories are what people remember. And stories really, yeah, they pull on people's heartstrings.
We can't tell people what to do, but a story elicits change.
100%. 100%. So over the past 9 years, and I'll just share this with you briefly, I have spoke all over the nation. I have been in Texas, I've been in New York, I've been in California. I said, if you don't think I'm dedicated, I went to Alaska for 2 weeks in the month of December when there's only 5 hours
commitment.
a day. So I have been all over. Yep, I do a lot of work with the Army. I've been to West Point. I'm going back to West Point this fall in September because the military really, they have twice their suicide rate is twice what the civilian rate is here in our country, and our rate is terrible right now. So I know that if I can get in front of I can go speak at a high school, maybe speak to several hundred kids in a day, or I can go on a military base and I can speak to 5, 6, 7,000 in a couple days. So I can reach a wide audience of young men, and young men's mental health matters to me because my son was, 20 years old. Evan was 21 years old, and suicide happens 4 to 1 in young men. So that's why we have to really make sure, people are checking on their sons, checking on their brothers, checking on their husbands, because depression can wear a lot of faces, and you can hide a lot of things. And so that's a little bit about our stories, Suzanne.
I want to tell you the biggest thing that struck me of what you said is Austin was high performing. Because one of the things I've seen over and over between just my former students, my high performing students, my students at the psychiatric unit, is the kids that look really good are more at risk because you assume they're good. And here's the other thing. I have a podcast with he was the class president of the high school, like super high end area.
Oh, my son was president, right? All 4 years. All 4 years.
Yeah, he graduated neuroscience, and he said to me in this interview, I didn't know I was supposed to have problems because I've got the world by the tail. So in his mind, as a teenager struggling with anxiety and depression, because he was like top of his class and top notch, he actually didn't even consider that anxiety and depression aren't something that you should be living with, because why would I have problems? And that has to be talked about.
Yeah, yeah.
We have
I
to,
think
it's
it's
not just the kids that look high risk at all.
I always say high achievers equal high risk.
Yeah.
And then you can
Yeah.
do that again and again. We lost over 400 physicians, doctors last year to suicide in our country.
Wow,
You know,
really?
so if you think about it, these people have worked their whole life. They've gone through medical school, they've gone through
Yeah.
residency, they've gone through it all. They're high achievers. But, the thing about it with our son, and I was supposed to do a TEDx talk during COVID and it got shut down. And I keep thinking I need to do it. I need to do it. Several people have asked me to do it. But I said if I ever did a TEDx talk, my topic would be how perfectionism killed my son, because I
Totally.
believe
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
we have to know how to fail, and we have to let our kids fail when they're young. We have to let them struggle. We have to let them be uncomfortable. I have a really good friend, Nicole Runyon, who lives up in Michigan, and she just published her first book. It's called Free to Fly, and it's about letting your kids feel discomfort, letting your
Yeah.
kids feel boredom, letting your kids feel these things, because this is what develops the brain, and this is what develops resilience.
Yeah.
And our son, he was so good at so many things, academics. He could crush it in the classroom, on the football field, on the track field. But, relationships are not perfect. And when you're young, they're definitely not perfect. So he would get into these relationships with girls, and he was so intense because he was such a high perfectionist. And, something would go wrong. And I'd say, Austin, you're young. There will be another girl that will be in your life.
Yeah.
You're learning about, the female gender right now. So, but I think that for him, if Austin got an A-, he was a loser. We always said when he was growing up, if he got in trouble, we didn't have to punish him because he punished himself enough.
Right.
So, letting the thing that if I could say anything to parents, especially if they're raising younger kids, is don't rescue your kids.
Yeah.
Don't run in there and try to fix their problems for them, because you have to let them fail. You have to let them trial and error. You have to let them problem solve. You have to let them figure it out, because that's what's going to build that resiliency. So when the bigger problems come later in life, which we know they do, Suzanne, right?
Yeah.
When they come, they're going to have some skills innate inside of them to know, okay, I lived through that. I'm going to be okay. I'm going to
Yeah.
live through this too. So that is a little bit of, what I think really led to, and I always say this, it's a perfect storm. It's never about one thing. Somebody doesn't just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to kill myself today. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
about, it's a lot of little things leading up, creating anxiety, creating stress. Then there's a trigger moment. There's something that happens, and because they don't have that innate resiliency where they can go, hey, I got through that, I'll get through this. They end up, and I say, it's never that I don't really think people want to die, and I don't think anybody ever wants to kill themselves. I think in that moment,
Right.
their brain is
Just-
offline, and they go, I got to shut this down. I have to stop this pain. This pain is overwhelming their brain, and their brain hasn't learned how to handle discomfort earlier in life. So they end up making a decision that costs them
Totally.
their life.
I also think it's so important to let the kids be free from expectations that they even put on themselves that we parents might not put on them. So there's a book, it's called Never Enough by Jennifer Wallace. Really good. And it's the toxicity of this expectation. And we're in a relatively, highly educated area here. And daily I've had to combat with my children. You're okay going to local college. Whatever grades you get, we just want you to do your best. You don't have to become a neuroscience. You're okay if you're not going to Sauder Business School at UBC at 18. And it's a constant battle, especially when you're in those areas that are higher achieving. And I've seen with kids, there's an unspoken expectation that they put on themselves just by what's around them, just even without parents putting it, right? Because you're in that culture and everybody's doing well, and you got surgeons and doctors and CEOs and lawyers around you, and I need to do that. And it's toxic. It's something that we need to be dealing with more.
I think you bring up a good point there. I think that you have to have expectations, but I think they have to be what your kids want to to get out of their life. And I think, I'm going to use this as an example. I have a niece. She and her husband are both attorneys. They met in law school, high achievers. Her husband's a patent attorney, and they have these two boys. And these boys never wanted to go to law school. They never wanted, they didn't, that wasn't what their interest was in.
Right,
They weren't
right.
interested in the law.
Yeah.
So, especially their oldest son during COVID. I mean, he was in high school during the worst of COVID. I mean, he had a drive-by graduation. It was just terrible. Took a toll on his mental health. So, he gets to college and he struggles. I mean, he really struggled to get a bad moped accident his first semester, and he had just a lot of things that happened to him. Now, he's taken an extra year to graduate. But he is going to be a teacher. I'm so proud of him.
I love him. We need teachers.
Right?
Yeah.
He's going to be a teacher.
Yeah.
He's the president of the Student Teacher Association at his college. He's doing his student teaching at the Navajo Nation. But he had to go through these hard things. And he had to figure it out for himself. And, his mom was a bit of a helicopter mom, trying to rush in and rescue him. And I said, you have to pull back. You can't rush right in there and try to fix it for them. And it's hard. I know what I'm saying is hard. Trust me, I was the worst. If you could learn anything from me, I was the worst helicopter mom. And if I could go back and do it all over again, 100%, I would raise my kids so differently. I would raise them to give them opportunities to be involved in things that they really, really had an interest in. And not that I had an interest in for them, but they had an interest in. And just, letting them fail. If our world could get to this point where, now we have, social media, that's a whole nother topic for another podcast. We could go on and on about that. But, between AI, social media, and everything, in all of the pressure that we put on kids today, I understand why our suicide rate I don't like it.
Yeah.
But I understand why it's so high right now. And Gen Z, which is that generation, Gen Z is born between 1996 and 2012. So that encompasses a lot of kids. That Gen Z generation, we could talk about loneliness here for a minute. That Gen Z generation, they self-report as being lonely 85% of the time. Sometimes they're always lonely. Now, what's loneliness? Well, loneliness is the lack of having real, good, strong social connections. At least 2 to 3 of them in your life. So that generation, Gen Z, they were the first generation born with a cell phone, attached to their thumbs. They self-report as the most, tech savvy, loneliest generation ever. So what that should tell all of us is that if social media could solve our mental health problems, they'd be the healthiest generation, and yet they are the least healthy generation, and they are dying by suicide higher than anybody else.
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's so much to talk about these new generations. Let's switch gears now and talk about the connection of grief. I want to shift into maybe the hope of connection. So I want to know from you, well, first of all, you're in this club we've talked about on LinkedIn of parents that have lost their children. And you have said it's a powerful club of advocates to change the script. And I want to know first, talk to me about what is it of the grief that brings you together? And what's the hope within that connection?
Those are 2 great questions. I've had a lot of loss in my life, and I've gone through a lot of grief. I can talk about it in the context of suicide loss, but I've had a lot of loss beyond suicide. I lost 2 infant daughters 25 years ago, and then I lost my son almost 9 years ago. So I've had a lot of loss. The survivors of suicide loss, that's what we are. We are survivors of suicide loss, okay? And I have this thing with language, Suzanne, around suicide, because it is very important that we use the correct language, because we're trying to get rid of the stigma about suicide, and we're trying to get people to know to ask for help. It's okay not to have an okay day. This is what we need to understand. So there are you can die by suicide, okay? You don't commit it, okay? And I want to go back to where that word even commit comes from. If I can get one point out during this podcast, this is an important one. That word commit came about in the 1400s in England. When people would die by suicide back then, they would pull them behind a horse and they would drag them through town to disgrace them. They would throw their body in a trash heap because they wouldn't give their family a plot of land to bury them.
Really?
And then they would arrest their family. So that was called committing suicide, and that language went on and on and on. So I'm like, okay, here we are in 2025. I think we need better language. So I said, if we can keep it simple, you know, my son died. Did he die? Yes, he did die. And it was by suicide. He died by suicide.
It is
So
so
if we can
important.
stop, yeah, it's very
It's so
important.
important.
So, you know, you die by suicide, you know, and then there are survivors of suicide loss. That's what I am. I'm a survivor of suicide loss. There are no suicide survivors, okay? There are suicide attempt survivors. And that's very important to put that word attempt in there.
Yep.
So there are different categories of people. So I'm a suicide loss survivor. I have a lot of fellow survivor moms and dads. Some of my dearest friends are suicide loss moms. You know, we get each other.
You get
We
it.
don't have to say anything. We can look in each other's eyes and we know what's going on. We speak the same language. We have gone through a similar experience in life, and we're still here. We're still sharing our story. I have a very dear friend who lives over towards Chicago, Jill Wajenko, and she lost her 15-year-old son, Max. And I met her at a conference that I spoke at. And, you know, we are always talking about, you know, ways that we can use our story, use our pain, use what we've learned to help other people. Because we know, and, you know, my husband and I are people of faith. We knew within 24 hours of Austin's death, we were not going to be silent. You know, if there was any part of our story, we were going to use it to help other families. You know, we just had no idea what that was going to look like at the time. But when families come together, and I always say, you know, I've been doing a lot of work in grief and I've been speaking a lot and giving a lot of grief talks lately. But the one thing that you should never do is you should never grieve alone. You should always grieve in community because your healing is going to be found through other people. You know, it was the people that came after Austin died, the people that sat in my living room and just cried with me.
Yeah.
They didn't try to come up with the right words because there aren't any. There are no words that are going to fix loss. None. But they could sit with me. They could sit with me in the messiness of my grief. And over time, you know, I was able to figure out some sort of purpose I was going to put behind our story. And I was going to get out and I was going to start speaking. And for me, a lot of people say to me, Leslie, how do you go out and tell Austin's story over and over and over? Isn't that just so hard? And I said, it's hard and it also fills my bucket. Because if I can go to a military base, and I noticed about the second or third military base I went to, I started noticing a pattern. When I finish my talk, and my talk is a 90-minute presentation, we go into our entire story. I do a deep dive of the night Austin died, what happened, us being asked to identify his body, all of it. Because this is the reality of suicide, and they need to know what suicide looks like.
Yeah.
Then we talk about why it happened, the brain. The brain development is really important because that prefrontal cortex, that decision making, is not fully developed till you're at least 25 years old. So we talk about the brain. And then we go into some hard topics on military bases. We talk about unhealthy relationships. I give 8 warning signs of a toxic relationship, how to know if you're in one, how to identify, how to get out of one if you're in one. And then we talk about locking up their firearms. Because firearm safety is really important in the military community. And then from there, I give them my 3-3 challenge, and we talk about how we're going to stay here, and we're going to get through these moments. Because I always say you need a minimum of 3 people in your phone, and they're your people. And they know they're your people. They've accepted to be in your phone. You can call them any time of the day or night. 1 o'clock in the morning, they'll pick you up on the side of the road. Whatever's going on. So you need 3 people in your phone. Not 1, not 2, 3. And you need 3 places. Now, those places can be a gym that you go to every day. They can be your church. They can be maybe, if you're on a military base, they might be, the chaplain. They can be different places, but you got to have three people and three places. And those are what are called protective factors, because a lot of people want to talk about risk factors with suicide, but I always talk about protective factors, what
Right.
keeps them
Right.
here. We've been
Yep.
talking about risk factors for years, Suzanne, and it's not doing us any good.
Right.
Our rates are going
Yep.
up. So we're going to talk about protective factors. So we build in these protective factors, and it gives them something to turn to. It's innate in them. So when they know, okay, my brain's starting to go here. I'm going down a bad path. I got to call. I got to call Brian. I got to call Josh. I got to call somebody. And they get on the phone with another person. That voice, that human connection. When you're talking about connection, the power of connection is huge. And I always say connection is protection, because when you're in those suicidal moments, and we can talk about that, you have anywhere from 2 hours to 28 hours. That is the most highly suicidal moment for an individual. If you can get somebody through that period of time, through that 28 hours, chances are greater than 90% they'll never die by suicide. So it's just giving them these tools to hang on when they feel that way. So if they can go to a place or they can go to a person, they have a greater chance of staying here. But the connection that comes through parents is very powerful. And we support each other, we support each other's nonprofits, we support each other's work, because I always say in mental health, you need to collaborate. There's no room for territorial things or whatever. So Jill has a nonprofit that she runs over in her area that's postvention. Postvention is after suicide, and I always say good postvention is prevention, because anytime someone dies by suicide, the family, the friends are at a higher risk. She takes these beautiful hope baskets in the immediate aftermath. They have all kinds of cool things in them. They have plants, they have all kinds of resources of local therapists. They have, some food in there. They have all kinds of things. She takes these beautiful hope baskets to families. She runs a support group over there for people who have lost people they love to suicide. She has events throughout the year. Her son was a big skateboarder, so they do these big events in skateboard parks throughout the year. So she has different things. So, everybody has their way. I speak on military bases. I speak in front of groups of young men. I get out wherever I can. And that's, how we keep each other going through connection.
What I'm hearing you say is that the hope of that connection of you parents that are survivors of suicide loss is you want change. Like your hope is, I'm changing this world and I'm taking that pain that I have that's unimaginable so that we can do good with this. And you're doing that collectively. Like that's powerful.
Yep.
And you're doing it in your own way.
Yep, exactly. Because, it's not enough. I could write about suicide all day long, every day. I do a daily mental health post, a thought that comes to me, something on LinkedIn. I write, but I could write about that every day. But if I'm not putting something behind it, if I'm not really getting out ahead of it, and I always say, every time I share my story, a little part of my own heart gets healed. Because in the sharing of my story, I give permission to people to be real and come and tell their truth to me. So when I go on these military bases, I could tell you story after story after story, and I'll share one with you, of things that happened. But after I finish speaking, I go into all of that. They've heard all the ugliness of our story. They've heard the hope of our story. They've heard the way that they can hold on and be here tomorrow. They will line up on the side of the stage wherever I speak. They'll line up if they don't have to be somewhere. And they want to come and tell me their story. Right. They want to share.
Sure,
and that's when I can really kind of assess, okay, who needs to be seen today? There's something called MFLACs, that's Military Family Life Counselors. So when I speak, I always ask for mental health support in the back, because my talk is very triggering. So I ask for mental health support in the back. I ask for chaplains to be back there. I ask for MFLAC counselors. And I notice when I do my slide on the 8 warning signs of a toxic relationship, they will always get real fidgety. They have to go to the bathroom. A lot of them will hit the aisle.
Interesting.
So I started kind of calling them, and I started calling them out on it. I said, listen, this next slide, some of you are not going to like, and you're probably going to need to go to the bathroom right now. And it's okay, you can go, But I want to share with you, if you get up and go to the bathroom, your chaplain's going to be following you in there. You're not going by yourself. Or you
That's
can sit
great.
here with me, right? And you can
Yeah,
listen
yeah.
to this. So, we go through all that because these young men, they are generally about 18, 19 to 22, 23. They're in that sweet spot. They're before their brain gets fully developed. And they're away from home, many of them for the first time ever. A lot of them joined the army or joined the military because they wanted to belong. They wanted a family. They had a lot of dysfunction growing up. And they get in there and it's much harder than they thought it was going to be. So, the fact that, and I tell all of them at the end of my talk, I said, listen, I'm going to tell you something right now. I came here as not a polished speaker, but as a mom. And I said, if you're needing a hug, get your butt up here and I'll give you one. But I said, you need to know you are here for a reason. You're in my talk today for a reason, and you're here on this earth for a reason. So I want you to stick around because the pain you're going through right now is going to help somebody else get through their story someday. And that's why we're here, Suzanne. We take our stories and we move them forward. And that's what survivor parents do. Yeah.
So I'm not a survivor of loss of suicide. You and I spoke last month and I posted about this after my 20-year-old son was in bed. I was outside, did not wake him up. And that for me is heartbreaking, just even this dichotomy between you and I. And so tell me about the hope of connection of, say, me, that I'm not in your powerful club, and you, in terms of the hope of connection of your grief and us coming together to bring hope within that.
I'm so grateful you still have your son and your son is here. I think every parent, I shouldn't say this, but for the most part, most parents have children and they want to give them a better life than the one they had. That's always our wish, to give them a better life than the one we had. Now, for the first time ever in history, this generation is not expected to live as long as their parents did. And that speaks volumes.
Yeah.
And so I think to connect to parents and to let parents know, I've got some good friends up. One is in Canada, Chris Coulter, who is running the Mentor Well. He lost his daughter Maddie, and mentorship is huge. To let parents know there are resources all around you. You don't have to parent alone because parenting is hard work. And so, Chris and Alana Tart, who lives in Switzerland, I had a conversation with them both last week. They're developing this beautiful mentor program because a parent can't be a mentor. You can be a parent, but you can't mentor your child. Yeah. So to have positive voices speaking, and I wrote a post about it yesterday, speaking into the life of your kid, that you can't have enough positive adult role models in your kid's life. And you never know when one thing they say or something they do, some statistics here for you. If you put a mentor in a young person's life around the age of 14 or 15 years old, somebody that's going to show up for them at their, games or, pick them up after school or, be part of their life. If you put a mentor in their life, they are 85% less likely to develop a drug and alcohol problem in their life.
Wow.
How much suicide involves drugs and alcohol? Well, I think it's underreported. They say at least 50% of all suicides involve drugs and alcohol. So putting mentors in young people's lives is incredibly protective. That's what I'm talking about with those protective factors. And I think a couple points here. One I really want to make is so many parents are afraid to talk about the S word, right? Suicide. Right. They're afraid to talk about the S word because if I talk about it, I'm going to give them the idea. Well, I can tell you something. First of all the data, all the research shows us that's 100% false. You can't plant an idea of suicide in someone's head if they've never had it. So if I come into your studio today, Suzanne, and you said to me, Leslie, are you thinking about suicide? Have you thought about suicide lately? And I can say, not today, Suzanne, I'm not thinking about it. It's not there. Now, if I've been having these thoughts and I'm struggling, I'm like, I'd just be better off not being here. if a parent asks a child, and you have to use the word suicide, you can't beat around the bush. You ask them, have you ever thought about suicide or had any thoughts about it? All of a sudden, that kid's ears perk up and they notice, you notice I'm struggling. You notice my pain. You notice I'm really working through some things. So that gives them a chance to open up. Now, if they tell you yes, and we can talk about QPR, question, persuade, and refer. It's a 1-hour course. I think all parents should take it. It's online. You can take the gatekeeper course online. But if they say yes, you can't be shocked. You have to be calm. They say yes. You need to ask open-ended questions, and you need to shut up. You need to be quiet,
Totally.
judgment-free. So when they answer yes, you need to say, I am so sorry. How long have you felt this way? How long has this been going on? And then you ask them these questions and you get them to open up and you keep that conversation going, because that's how you're going to determine what kind of help they need. But I think it's very important for parents to continue having this conversation. Make it part of your normal, make the mental health conversations part of what you do in the house. And time and place matter. My kids, I could always talk to them the best. Seems like when I was driving in the car, because
Right.
I was looking ahead, my hands were on the steering wheel, and these conversations would just pop up. So get your kids in a spot, in a place your child best, where they're gonna have these open conversations with you, and continue having them. Continue having them.
I think that part of that hope of that connection is I can also promote that and do that and not have to be a mother who has lost a child to suicide, because we can all come together as community.
Absolutely.
Whether we have those
Absolutely.
experiences and have those dialogues, and what you are saying, like to be able to promote that in our own realms and
100%.
do it ourselves. But we need a village
Mm-hmm.
of people coming together.
Statistics are so high now, Suzanne, and it's happening once every 40 seconds. While we'll be
Yeah.
on this podcast,
Yeah.
we will lose, I don't even know how many people in an hour. We will lose these people. So, the other night I went and talked to a grief group. Now, they had lost people through all sorts of ways. But in that grief group, there were about 50 people there that night. There were 6 who were brave enough to say they had lost someone to suicide. So that's 10% in my
Yeah.
town
That talked about it.
that talked about it. 100% that talked about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's yeah.
I want to take us to wrap up about your advice for parents. I think that that's a really, more than anything, important way to finish this dialogue. I want to know your number one piece of advice then for parents whose child looks like they are struggling. It is evident. What's your number one thing for that parent to do?
Okay. I kind of just went through it a little bit.
Number
The
one.
number one thing that you need to do, if you think your child is struggling with thoughts of suicide, you need to meet them head on and ask the question. It's a hard question. And there is QPR, question, persuade, and refer. You can look it up, QPR. There's training for $29.95. You can take it online. And it helps you know how to start the conversation, to question, and then to persuade, and then to refer. So the number one piece of advice I would say is have mental health conversations with your kids from the time they're little, and it can be age appropriate, to as they grow. Because they're going to hear about suicide. They're going to be around suicide. If they have a phone, they're going to know quite a bit about suicide, because the garbage that's on social media is going to tell them, and it's going to feed them. The algorithms are going to feed them stuff about suicide. So you want to be the one talking about it to them, not other people.
Right.
So you need to have the conversation with your child. You need to ask them with the word, have you ever thought about suicide? Tell me more. And ask open-ended questions. And then you need to be quiet, and you need to listen. And you need to not judge them. And you need to give them space to talk. If they know they have a safe, judgment-free space to talk at home, that's going to be incredibly protective for them as they grow up.
And they
So
talk.
that's my number one thing that I would say to any parent. And I would really strongly suggest, people always do these book clubs together, which are great. But I always tell everybody, do a QPR club together. Get a group of parents, like 6 or so, and then all take this class together. And then you can dialogue with each other. You can role play. You can, practice how you're going to talk to your kids. Because it is the most life-saving thing you'll ever do for your child.
Yeah.
And I wish I would have had that conversation with my son years ago.
Well,
And it is so important.
so here's wrap up question number 2 is for somebody like Austin who was not appearing to struggle, high achieving, cat's meow, like world by the tail. What is your advice then to those parents? I know it's going to be similar, but I wanted to flip that switch of
High
those
achievers,
kids that are high. They look great. They look
right? I
great. They're
have a
good
lot of
looking
parents
and
tell
they're
me,
getting good grades. What's your advice to those parents where nothing seems wrong?
100% Suzanne. I have so many parents saying to me, oh, it's good, she's in band, or, I've got her in cheerleading, or, whatever. Your kids need a little downtime. It's very, very important that you're not running from activity to activity to activity. We all need downtime. We all need time to just take a breath, right? So I think if your kids are high achievers, I mean, Austin would go from track to football
Yeah.
to student council to he had something going on every hour of the day. So I think it's really, really important if you have, especially if you have high achieving kids, start this conversation early and have it often. Be always
Right.
talking
Yeah.
about mental health in some capacity, in some form, every day of the week. Have it be a little snippet here, a conversation here, so they know that it matters to you. And I think a really good thing with those kids, Suzanne, is to share a story of when you yourself have struggled. Tell them about a hard time
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
had. Because when you make yourself real to your child and they know that you've struggled, but they look at you and you're an adult and you're still here and you're doing well, they know they have the opportunity to go through things and be safe and wind up where you are. So always share your own personal struggles with your kids. It's very, very important to have that conversation with them.
I think it's too, we never assume. Like it's always got to be on our radar. And even like
Absolutely.
the boy I talked to you about, he didn't think that he should have any issues. So having that dialogue as parents of how are you feeling and just opening up that discussion about what's going on with them that might not be actually how they should be living with anxiety and depression and self-harming,
Yeah,
whatever
and
it
I
is
would
that's
love to
hidden.
come back at some point and talk to you a little bit more about social media when we have time because there's
Oh
so many
gosh.
factors
I know.
involved.
Yeah.
We have something called wait until eighth, which is wait until the eighth grade. So there's parents that sign a contract. You get 10 families together and they all
Awesome.
sign a contract that their child will not be given a phone, no social media until they are in the eighth grade. So these kids are together. They don't feel
Yeah.
like they're ostracized. They don't feel like they're strange. There are other kids that don't have phones too, and they know that.
Coming
So
together.
there are different things. I recommend every parent, if you can, if you care, get Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, because it is a game changer for how you will parent your child. He has
Absolutely.
spent decades doing the research and the work. So it's really important to understand. And so I think every parent needs to have access to their child's cell phone. They need to know the password, and the phone needs to be turned in at night. It doesn't need to be in their bedroom with them. So those are 3 things that I think every parent should follow.
Okay, here's my last question to completely wrap us up. Can you tell me your biggest message of hope for parents who have lost a child to suicide?
Well, I come through it through a lens of faith. We had a lot of signs after Austin died, a lot of confirmations that we will see him again. I believe, I share with all parents, you're never going to get over this loss. Suicide is a complicated grief. There's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of blame, and
Yeah.
you're never going to get over this. But in time, if you allow yourself to do the work that grief will do in you, and I always tell everybody, if you feel like you need to cry, pull your car over on the side of the road and have yourself a good cry. If you feel like you have to do this, do it. But I said, the thing of it is, if you allow grief to do its work in you, and you can work with a grief therapist. I've spent a lot of time in grief therapy in my life. But if you allow your grief to work its way through you, eventually, I think the most healing thing that can come out of a suicide loss is when someone comes up to you and tells you, because of your story, I'm still here. And I've had so many people, and I'll end this with you real quickly here. I was on the base, and I was down in Texas at Fort Cavazos, Fort Hood, formerly Fort Hood, one of the largest military bases in our country. They have over 100,000 soldiers on that base. And it was the fifth talk I had done that week. It was the last talk. I had my luggage with me. I was headed to the airport. And for some reason, I asked this question I've never asked before. I said, do I have any soldiers out there from the great state of Indiana? I had one soldier that raised his hand. And guess what his name was, Suzanne?
Austin.
Austin.
Oh,
So
Leslie.
I gave my talk. I did my whole talk. I talked about everything. At the end, they were all coming up to talk to me. He waited over on the side. He made his way up. I could tell he'd been crying. He had broken up with his girlfriend on the way to my talk. He was getting deployed on Monday, and he had an entire plan to take his life on Saturday. He had a suicide plan.
Wow.
So we talked for a while. We cried together for a while. I took him to an MFLAC counselor. I said, listen, you've got this. His girlfriend was pregnant. That's why he stayed in an unhealthy relationship. I said, you have a child coming into the world. You need to be a healthy father. You don't need to stay in a relationship that's unhealthy, but you need to be a healthy father. So we got him help. We got him in to see a counselor immediately. He ended up having a little girl. He's still here. That's why I do what I do.
There's your
And
hope.
when that happens, that's the hope that
There's
comes
your
back
hope.
into me. And yes, and it pours back into me
Wow.
so I can go out and I can keep
Yep.
on doing it again.
It gets you out of bed in the morning.
It definitely gets me out of bed in the morning. It sure does.
Leslie Weirich, thank you so much for this discussion. And the work you're doing, like, you go, girl. Keep at
Thank
it.
you. I appreciate it. I don't think my work's ever going to go away,
Yeah.
but I am going to try to see what kind of an impact I can have as long as I'm able to. Thank
you
you
so much. Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you want more episodes about how to support your child in terms of suicidal ideation, or even if you're worried that they're not okay, there are links below from previous podcast episodes I did on audio of how to support suicidation. And you can do your part. Share this with somebody that might need it, a parent that's concerned for their child, and you can subscribe to this channel. So many more episodes to come of how we connect with our kids and get on their own turf. And click like on that little link below. I'd love some comments if you want future episode ideas or just some questions to respond to. I'll see you next time.